everyone, and welcome to episode 255 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you're listening to this podcast, it's likely you'll agree that whatever our thoughts on the medieval period, they're rarely ever neutral. In fact, the Middle Ages is arguably one of the biggest hot-button historical periods of all time in that people really love it and find it amazing, or they think it's horrible and disgusting and worth forgetting about altogether. When someone evokes the medieval in conversation or in media, they're looking for you to feel something. So the question becomes, what are they trying to get you to feel? And how are they accomplishing it? This week, I spoke with Dr. Usha Vishnuvajjala about her work on feminist medievalisms. Usha is an assistant professor of English at the State University of New York, New Paltz, the co-editor of Women's Friendship in Medieval Literature alongside Karma Lockery, and the author of many articles on medieval literature, Arthurian literature, and medievalism. Her new book is Feminist Medievalisms, Embodiment and Vulnerability in Literature and Film. Now, I know feminism is a loaded term for some people, so before we begin, let's all take in a big inhale and exhale, because Usha is not only one of the smartest scholars in our field, but if you love the Middle Ages and hold it close to your heart like she does, chances are a lot of what she says is going to resonate. Our conversation on what the terms feminist and medievalism mean to her and how they work together, as well as some of the surprising places the medieval world pops up in the modern world, and how it's perfectly okay to love medieval fiction, is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Usha. I was just saying to you, I'm so happy to meet you because we've been around each other forever, and it's just so nice to actually have a conversation. So welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to actually have a conversation with you too after all this time.
Okay, so your new book is about feminist medievalisms, and I think that we really need to talk about terminology because those words have all sorts of meanings to all sorts of different people. So when we say feminist, it means something in scholarship in the ivory tower, the world of academia, and it means kind of something else outside of it. So when you're talking about feminist, especially in your scholarship, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in this book in particular, I do mean something quite specific, and I am drawing on feminist scholarship very much from inside academia, but I'm also thinking a lot about what I call feminist engagements and what those look like, feminist engagements with reading, with history, with fictional women, with real women from the past, with objects. And something that I am sort of trying to tease out in the book is that I think a feminist way of engaging with these things has to do in part with being vulnerable. And so this is something that is informed by some strands of feminist scholarship, but not all strands of feminist scholarship. So certainly there are feminist scholars who would reject that definition. But that was really important to me as I began working on this book. I realized that part of what I thought was really under-examined was the ways in which some people, and certainly this is not limited to women, so that was important to me. This is not about women's medievalism. The way some people are engaging with the past or ideas about the past or traces of the past is not just about kind of wanting to maybe feel powerful or feel associated with the powerful. We see plenty of that as well. But I was really interested in the way that we might think of a kind of ethical engagement with the idea of the past as one in which we kind of destabilize our own identities and our own feelings of safety and feel vulnerable and allow ourselves to kind of build an attachment to something through feeling vulnerable. And I think that has all kinds of implications for how we act in our present world and in our real world as well. So really a very specific definition of feminism or feminist that has to do with vulnerability, that has to do with a kind of attachment that is not about power, but in fact about kind of emotions and affect and kind of almost putting ourselves to the side, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So I'm gonna rephrase to see if I've got the picture and we're expressing the picture well. So this is sort of the type of engagement with something like a movie or a book or something like that you feel, that makes you feel something. It's not exclusive to the way that women feel when they're looking at stuff, but it's a way in which people have sort of pushed to the side as being like, this is the way women do it for a long time. But now we're opening this up and saying everyone is invited to look at the medieval world with their feelings. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And that very much kind of draws on some scholarship about medieval forms of engagement or affect or attachment. And in that kind of scholarship as well, there is that same, I think you phrased that so well, that same kind of trajectory of this is a thing that women do, so we're dismissing it. And then it kind of expanded. So there are lots of scholars who have written about religious practices in the late Middle Ages having to do with vulnerability and how they kind of started out as being thought of as women's practices, and then they spread. So I'm interested in something similar. Yeah. How can we kind of bring those forms of engagement out of the shadows, right? And not think of them as like this cringy thing that we associate with, I don't know, with having too many feelings, right? Or with being too attached, with being too emotional, with not being intellectual. So that kind of dichotomy between, or that false binary between emotional and intellectual is something that I'm kind of looking at throughout the book. And I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And I mean, I've definitely seen a change in the way that people who are talking about medieval studies are coming to it with feelings. And you must have seen, we're contemporaries, right? So you must have seen this shift as well in your lifetime. Like I remember, and I've said this before, like being at a conference and we were like having dinner. And this is when I was just about doing my master's. So like this is a while ago. And people were like, well, what got you interested in medieval studies? And I just flat out said Disney because I liked it. And everyone had this face like I had just flashed my underwear at the table or something. Like it was so gauche. You're not supposed to do that. But I feel like now you can say that kind of thing and it's fine. Like you can bring your own feelings to it. Although I still feel, and I don't know if you feel this as well, when people do this, they still feel a bit of trepidation. Like if you're going to like bring this to a conference or something and say, here's what I feel about the text, people are still like, oh gosh, I don't know if I can say it.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent, the way that we bring this into, say, like a conversation at dinner at a conference is going to be different than the way we bring it into a paper that we're presenting, right? Or a piece of work that we're writing. But I think it has a place everywhere. And I think I've been in those same conversations over dinner. And I, remember confessing probably like 15 years ago that I think my first medievalism that I really loved was Disney's Sleeping Beauty. And I think it was for a lot of people, actually, a lot of people like of our generation and probably some people older than us as well. And I do remember some people kind of getting mad at me and saying, well, that's really personal. And this is what, And that feels a lot better these days. Like you can admit those things, right? And you're allowed to like things and you're allowed to dislike things and you're allowed to have affective attachments to things. But I also think we're moving to a place now where people are comfortable. I mean, I feel personally that you have to kind of put those things out there first. And then once they're out there, you can kind of engage with them and you can kind of think, well, why did this appeal to me when I was 3 years old? Why did this appeal to me when I was 12 years old? And I actually think that can, for a lot of people, and I know some people doing this work now, I think that can be a great way into thinking about a text and into thinking about the reception of a text. I think it's much harder when we have those affective attachments or antipathies or whatever, and we're trying really hard to kind of suppress them and not think about them. I think that still kind of infects our scholarship, if that makes sense, right? It's just the repression of emotion is like it's never productive. So I think it's great to start from a place where we can kind of say, well, I like this. I don't like this. I loved this as a kid. Sometimes you go back to those things you loved as a kid and you're like, oh no, this is a terrible representation of the Middle Ages, right? I mean, I found this book that I had when I was maybe 4 or 5, this little picture book. And it just represented the Middle Ages as this terrible, violent, people could not go outside because there were robbers everywhere, right? Really, really violent. And I must have read this as a kid, but I have no memory of it because it didn't appeal to me. What appealed to me was the Disney Sleeping Beauty, right? And
yeah, it was Sleeping Beauty for me too. And then when I became a medievalist, I was like, well, why is that? I'm not afraid to look at the reasons for that. And the reasons for that is it's 14th century art and it's beautiful and it's uplifting and it makes people look like people. And that's kind of what I'm still doing. It's what you're still doing as well. So
yeah, 14th century art for me, so much of it was Tchaikovsky, right? And like, I guess Tchaikovsky's medievalism, if we want to think about that. And there's a lot of vulnerability in that film, right? I mean, they do feel like interesting, complicated characters. And I really like that. I love the squabbles between the fairies, right? I mean, yeah, it's kind of endlessly interesting.
I think so too. Okay. So the last term that I want to really make sure that we understand is medievalism. So when we're talking about medievalism, what does that mean?
Yeah. So different people will have different definitions. And I think it's still in some ways a fraught term in medieval studies, right? I mean, people have been working on it for 50 years, but I think a simplistic definition would be kind of any form of engagement or adaptation or reception with the Middle Ages. And I think there are the really kind of overt ones that we see everywhere, like films and novels and artworks that kind of allude to or maybe really directly reference or draw on medieval works. I'm interested in this book, as you know, in something slightly different than that, which is the kind of more subtle ways that works that don't seem overtly medievalist. So none of them are set in the Middle Ages. None of them are directly adapting a medieval text. But I still think that they are examining engagement with medieval culture in some way. And that, I think, is much less examined. And that's something that's always been interesting to me. I mean, I came to medieval studies from a background in political science and political theory. And so for me, my kind of way in was always that I was interested in the kind of unexamined or underexamined traces, not of medieval culture necessarily, but of modern, using that term kind of broadly to mean early modern to now, modern ideas about the Middle Ages and how those kind of inform how we think about ourselves. And so that's something I'm trying to do very much in the book. And I think the Jane Austen novel I look at, the Virginia Woolf novel I look at, those are both really, they're doing this. They're looking at how these kind of traces of ideas about the Middle Ages are subtly informing conversations and debates and representations in their own periods, but they're both set in the period in which they were written. They're not at all set, in the Middle Ages. And so I'm interested in that kind of what I would consider like a maybe more subtle medievalism. And I realize that's not what everyone expects when they pick up a book called Feminist Medievalisms. They might be expecting Game of Thrones and The Last Duel. And there have been so many recent films and TV shows and novels looking much more specifically at kind of women in the Middle Ages. And that's not what I'm doing. But I also think it's kind of equally important to examine how the idea of the Middle Ages functions in all the things that we don't think are medievalist. I think a lot of us who went into this field kind of think this is everywhere, right? And it needs to be kind of excavated and examined. And the ideas that we hold without realizing it, they do a lot of work in our world.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. It's like, it's not a cheat to go and look at something that is directly medieval, like Game of Thrones. That's not a cheat. That's fine.
But there's lots of great work out there doing all that. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But it's interesting to see the threads of things that come to us from the Middle Ages, especially like a medieval European context that are coming and making us think about things without us really realizing. And I think it is important to look at that. Some people are like, Star Wars, it's a medievalist film. And you're like, what? Until you start to say, oh, there's knights here and this is what they're doing. When you start to think about the way that, this medieval European idea has influenced, it's there. So we're going to talk about the two examples you have in the book that are from the 90s. And the other thing I want to mention about that is when people look at Game of Thrones from like a quote unquote feminist lens, people are expecting you're going to say, it's terrible, it's awful. We should not look at this. We should have no joy. There's no joy. And when I was thinking about these examples that you've pulled out from the 90s, a lot of the things that you're getting at, the embodied experiences are ones of joy. So I really also want to say, before we get into the actual stuff the digging you've been doing here, really, people shouldn't expect that if you're looking at something with a feminist lens, that it's going to be angry and joyless.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think one of the big surprises for me of writing this book, and especially chapter 3, where I look at the 1989 music video and the early 90s film, that was a big surprise for me, was like how joyful it was to watch these over and over again and analyze them and read about them and think about them and write about them. And, I've watched the Like a Prayer video now probably 300 times and it did not diminish my enjoyment of it at all, which I think is really remarkable. I can't think of many music videos I could watch 300 times and still love them. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really joyful. And I think it's also important to kind of think about the ethics of what it means. If we can't have conversations about feminist engagements, about women's experiences, about feminist experiences, without imagining them as angry or unhappy, unpleasant, miserable for us, I don't know what we're doing. There has to be joy also. In being feminist or being a woman it's not just a slog of misery. I mean, it has its moments of that, sure, but there has to be joy too. And I think there is so much joy in these texts. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed writing about them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it comes through. And it was nice because the film that you're talking about, I'm using the words the 90s to make it easier for me to just put it out there. But the 1989 movie, Sister Act, which I did show to my kids and it held up.
I think that's actually, 1992. And then
is it 92?
Yeah, Like a Prayer is 89. But
Okay.
yes, it holds up so well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Okay. So Sister Act, you're pulling out as an example of medievalism. Tell us how this works.
Yeah, so obviously this is not an overt medievalism. It's not a super direct medievalism, but I loved this movie as a kid. I have to say, loved it so much as a kid, watched it over and over again, and then didn't watch it for probably 20 years or,
Yeah.
18 years or something. And then I watched it in the summer of 2020, and I had already started working on the first chapter of this book. And I was like, this is about a woman who's not a nun finding community and safety and refuge and like new forms of friendship and association in a community of nuns. This is just like all these medieval texts I'm reading. So I could not get out of my head that I needed to incorporate it into the book. I mean, that is it is a very examined in the scholarship aspect of medieval culture. The idea that nuns, that convents were these sites of women's community and women's power. And in some ways, women's autonomy, right? And refuge for women. And in some, there's some medieval texts in which they're also refuge for medieval men, right? And I think that's actually like a really underappreciated thing in modern culture. We see a lot of mentions of it in scholarship, but I don't think in popular culture, there's much of an understanding of the fact that actually there were these sites of medieval women's power and community and autonomy, a lot of which were lost at the end of the Middle Ages. So for me, it actually started to feel really recuperative to think about this film representing something that most people don't know women had in the Middle Ages. And that is kind of my way into thinking about it. So I know there probably are like simplistic ways of kind of saying like, well, it's a Catholic church and a cathedral and that's medieval. And that's not really what I'm doing. But I'm really interested in the kind of way that it represents the character played by Whoopi Goldberg, who is, I should just say a little bit about the.
Yeah.
Okay. So she's a lounge singer and she accidentally witnesses a murder. So she sees her boyfriend and his associates kill someone and she's not supposed to be there. And she runs and she goes to the police and they decide, or one man, I think he's a lieutenant, decides to hide her in this convent. And she's horrified. And she's like, what am I going to do with these nuns? She refers to them once as nothing but a bunch of white women dressed as nuns. And she's the only Black woman there. And also she at one point says, these people don't even have sex. Right? She's really horrified by the idea of being like locked up with these nuns. And she tries to escape repeatedly at the beginning. And it's not really through her deciding to be like them so much as it's her coming to appreciate the ways that they're not like her and them coming to appreciate the ways that she's not like them that creates a sort of new form of community between them. And it changes her and it changes the nuns. And once they find out that she's not a nun and she's actually a lounge singer who's been hiding there for her safety, their kind of love for her is not dimmed at all. Right. And I think for me, that's telling a really important story that would have been possible in the later Middle Ages. And that I was kind of astonished to realize is possible now or in the 1990s. And I really wanted to connect to that thread.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, it's interesting because that movie was a smash. Mm-hmm. It's become a musical. It had a sequel, all of these things. And it's very interesting because it's about a bunch of nuns.
Yeah.
And the ways in which like a community of the men are very much bit players in this.
Yeah.
A community of women, how they are communicating with each other and finding compassion. Like this doesn't seem like the type of story, if you describe it that way, that it would in any way be a hit, but it was. And I think it has so much to do with people just allowing themselves to feel for people who are different and see the ways that they feel for each other. And you could have written this story in the Middle Ages. 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can reel off lists of medieval romances in which women who are not nuns go to seek refuge in a convent. In some cases, they become nuns, and in others, they don't. They just kind of go hang out. And yeah, I agree. Like you could have written this story in the Middle Ages, and I do think part of the reason that it works and that it was such a hit is because it's so joyful. We still, for whatever reason, struggle a bit with like letting women be joyful. Yeah. And we expect, especially we don't expect that in a movie about nuns. We got a woman like running, in fear of her life. She's like basically in like a witness protection program is why she's in the convent. We don't expect that to be a joyful story. And actually for me, that is also a way in which I think it is like some of the medieval romances I study, right? we don't necessarily expect there to be joyful stories about women, but there are, even in situations where you might not expect there to be joy. Coming back to this film in 2020, that was a revelation for me, that you could tell this story and be joyful about it.
Yeah, especially because like Whoopi Goldberg says, her character says right at the beginning, like, we should not expect nuns to be happy given the conditions that they live under. And it's funny because like in the Middle Ages, people are saying exactly the same things about nuns in the monastery. Like, I can't even imagine being one. And yeah, if you look through their lens, then you see that the joy that they could have within their lives, and also the ways in which, well, maybe they could loosen up a little bit.
Yeah, like we see that there's more than one way to be a nun, and there's more than one way to be a woman who lives in a convent. I mean, I think Dolores also sees throughout the film that there's like more than one way for her to use her gifts. I really love that everyone is kind of transformed by their kind of association with each other. Yeah. And that transformation she doesn't stay in the convent. Like, she leaves at the end, right?
Yeah, they can transform without losing any parts of themselves, which is really quite good. And I think one of the things that you mentioned as well is that you can have this interracial relationship between people without anybody losing anything. And I think that is such an important part of the film, and maybe what made it resonant to audiences.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I think I mentioned this in the book, that I found out when I was working on the book that the film was initially written for Bette Midler, and she dropped out pretty late, and Whoopi Goldberg is a late replacement, which might be one reason that there's not that much attention in the dialogue to her race. But, they bring it in here and there, like especially when she says there's nothing here but a bunch of white women dressed as nuns. I think that's such an interesting line. Mm-hmm. But yes, that there's a sense in which she does not have to give up anything about who she is, right? I mean, she's, yes, living by the rules of the convent. So like no men and no booze, I guess, although she does sneak out and go to a bar. But there are these differences between them. And I also think it's really interesting that the things about her that seem like they'll be out of step with the convent all ended up being wonderful things for the convent, right? I mean, so she is drawing on a different musical background, although it's not really contemporary 1992 musical background either. It's like girl groups and Motown and all this kind of stuff and gospel. But that she brings all that to them, and they need it. And she also kind of needs what they bring to her. And I think you're right that probably that's one of the reasons that it was so popular. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that what you're doing now is setting a really great example of how you can watch a movie from 1992. You can feel a lot of things. You can also think about it deeply, and you can apply exactly the same strategies to looking at a Marian story from the Middle Ages or a romance from the Middle Ages and say, wow, I really feel for this character or something. And that's totally legitimate. So you feel for it, and then you also can apply these steps in analysis as well. Yeah. So I think that like you're walking us through a really great way of scholarship while we're talking, which is awesome.
Thank you. For me, it's so fun to think about like, well, why is the film making me feel this way? Like, what is the film doing that's making me feel this way? And so much of it, as you will have seen if you read the chapter, I was thinking about things like camera angles and editing and the different types of shots that the film used and the sound editing and all this kind of stuff. So I can have all those feelings and then take a step back and say, like, what is producing those feelings? And to a degree, of course, I can say it's coming from the plot. It's coming from the camera angles. It's coming from the fact that when the nuns are singing in public for the first time with Dolores, the camera shows us her face. So you can see that she's mouthing the words back to them and they're singing to her, right? Which is, I think it's like so moving. And I think you can do both of those things at the same time. I mean, we don't have to put our own responses to your text aside. We just have to be able to think about them, somewhat critically, but that doesn't mean that we're tamping them down.
Yeah, that's right. We can have feelings and be smart, which is not something that women have always been allowed to do. So here we are. We're doing it. We're doing it right here. Okay. So I was going to turn our attention to something that might be having a resurgence this summer, thanks to Deadpool and Wolverine. And that is Madonna's Like a Prayer, which, I mean, Madonna's early work especially is firmly rooted in the Catholic Church, maybe none more so than this one. So walk us through the video, Like a Prayer. What's happening in it?
Yeah, so it actually has a really complicated plot, which I kind of realized when I was trying to summarize it in the book. And I thought, oh no, how am I going to do this? So it's 4 minutes long and it's so complicated. But I would describe it, certainly other people might describe it differently. I would describe it primarily as a dream vision. The kind of frame story is that this character who I refer to her in the book as Madonna the witness to distinguish her from Madonna the singer or the artist who we see in some shots. Madonna the witness, the character, witnesses a murder. So four white men kill a woman who looks like her, has similar hair, is dressed similarly. And she sees this, she's sort of hiding and she witnesses this. And one of them looks up and makes eye contact with her. And so she knows that they've seen her. They run away and a black man runs up to try to help the woman. And as he's like lifting her head and shoulders off the ground, the police come and they arrest him. Madonna is sort of, again, Madonna the witness is sort of hiding in the shadows of a building. And then she runs away and she runs into a church. And we don't see this all in order. We see this in snippets throughout the video, but she runs into the church, although actually from the outside, it's a police station. But when she goes inside and closes the door, it becomes a church. And when she's in the church, she's in the dream. She's dreaming. So I think the suggestion that we get by the end is that she has gone into the police station, fallen asleep, dreamt that she's in a church. Although I could see someone interpreting differently. Mm-hmm. While she's in the church, she has these visions, including of a statue that it's played by the same actor as the man who's arrested for the murder. And it is both religious and erotic. So she starts by like touching his feet and stuff. She kisses his feet. They do kiss and he kind of comes to life and he cries. And in between, there's like all these images of Jesus as a baby and like all this kind of stuff. I mean, if you slow it down, you get these split-second images throughout it that are really, it's just really interesting. And I could not analyze all of them. I mean, there's just so much. But one of the things I was really interested in was the use, again, of camera work to kind of show us the character's vulnerability, the character's fear. So there's a shot where the camera is showing us Madonna, the witness's kind of perspective, and the camera is shaking, right? So you get the sense that she's shaking, which I really, really liked. I thought it was really interesting. So this is, in some ways, this is about a woman in a moment of extreme vulnerability, right? She's witnessed a murder. The men may have wanted to murder her, right? They may have gotten the wrong woman. They've seen her. They know she's witnessed it. She's seeking refuge. And then instead of just going somewhere where she can hide and feel safe, she has this dream vision where she's sort of pushed through all of these different affective registers, where she's identifying with this religious figure who looks just like the man who was arrested. She's singing with a choir. At one point, she's falling through the sky. Like a lot of things happen. She wakes up and she's in a police station. It's the same building, but it's a police station. And in between, there are shots of Madonna, the singer, dancing in front of burning crosses, which is partly why that video was so controversial in 1989, the burning crosses, and a few other things. So there's, a lot going on. That was not a very succinct summary. That's the best I can do.
In the end, she has this revelation that it's unjust that this man has been arrested. And I think at the end, she says he didn't do it. And then, the man is released and everything is fine. Nice,
happy ending that is like completely wildly unrealistic. And the video draws attention to this by, as soon as that happens, the camera kind of pans out and everyone is like on a stage and this curtain descends and they all are dancing and they like take a bow. So there's this sort of like tidy, happy ending that I think, might occur just to like kind of close off our interpretations of this. But I think there's so much else going on besides that tidy, happy ending there and that was a revision also. In her original treatment of the video, it was like much more violent and she and the man were both going to be shot in the back as they ran away. So there was kind of a late revision to change the way the video ended. But it was very much commenting on contemporary events and commenting on contemporary events that maybe a lot of people weren't thinking about in 1989. It was controversial in different parts of the world for different reasons. So in the US, it was controversial largely because of his commentary on race relations, I think. But I've gathered from talking to friends and from reading around that in Italy, for example, it was controversial in different ways. It was controversial partly because there's sort of a sexy scene with a religious figure in a church, right? And the burning crosses didn't really bother people as much necessarily in other parts of the world. They really bothered people here in the US where I am, in particular because they evoked, the KKK and were very much like an overt critique of that. And that bothered people.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that kind of made me laugh out loud reading the book was that you have a scholar in it quoted saying that if Madonna is trying to make fantasies for men, she's not very successful at it. because this doesn't hit that spot for sure.
Yeah.
It's way too complex for that, even though she has those elements that people will criticize her for, or definitely criticize her for in 1989, was being too sexy. But at the same time, people didn't watch that video and think the thoughts that people have accused her of inciting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way to read anything in this video as like a straightforward appeal to the male gaze, if we might put it that way, right? This is not just about being titillating or being sexy to kind of straight men. It's much more complicated than that. And I think it's much more about her own sexuality, right? And it's much more about exploring that and the really complicated ways in which for her that was entwined with religion. And that, again, it's very much like Marjorie Kemp, I think, and people uncomfortable in the same way, right? Marjorie Kemp, the late medieval English writer, maybe mystic, maybe not really.
You said it.
Sorry. Sexy. I mean, I love Marjorie Kemp and I'm really interested in Marjorie Kemp. I would not call her a mystic. She has these like sexy fantasies about Jesus, right? And that really upset people at the time and it upsets people today. But Madonna's doing something really similar. Like this is very much about her exploring this kind of controversial aspect of maybe her own sexuality and of women's sexuality, and not really about presenting herself as a sex object. And, around the same time, she put a video for Open Your Heart, which I think the video came out the same year as Like a Prayer. But she's really there playing with the idea of being a kind of fantasy for men, because she herself plays the character who's sort of I think peep show is the right word. Like she's dancing in a room, scantily dressed, and there are men paying to like look into it for short periods of time. But at the end, she puts on, if I'm remembering it right, she puts on like a man's suit and hat, and she runs out of the building and like runs off with, I want to say he's like a little boy. I at least read that as her kind of embracing her own much more complicated identity, right? Like gender-wise, age-wise, sexuality-wise, where her best friend who she runs off with at the end of her workday is like this tween boy and she's wearing men's clothes. So I think there's always with Madonna this kind of interesting way, especially in that period where she's playing with other people's expectations of her, but kind of exploring all the ways that she doesn't fit them.
Well, and I think that is actually a good way to steer us back into the Middle Ages, in that when people, I think students especially, read something, especially around that late 14th century, early 15th century period where you're reading stuff and it's devotional and you're like, okay. And then you see that it is an erotic fiction involving Jesus. It's startling to people. Yeah. But it definitely exists, which I think shows that like people have very complex ways in which they're bringing feelings to things that maybe today or like, you shouldn't have feelings about that, or you're supposed to have these feelings about, church, not the other ones. And so I think it's something that it's very familiar, so that when you talk about Like a Prayer as being medievalist, I think this is one of the ways in which it very much fits into that category.
Absolutely. I talk about this a little bit in chapter 4 of the book. And I don't think medievalists think this way, but I think as kind of people in the 21st century, we at times have this illusion or fantasy that we can compartmentalize so completely, that we can be spiritual in one setting and intellectual in one setting, and we are only really like in our bodies in other settings, right? And sexuality is over here and emotions are over there. And I think a lot of us maybe feel like the events of, at least where I am, the events of the last like 8 to 10 years have made a lot of people feel kind of fragmented, right? I mean, the pandemic and politics has been really complicated, and world events have been really complicated. I think there are reasons that many of us feel kind of fragmented. But one of the things that both of these texts, Like a Prayer and Sister Act, reminded me of, and that a lot of medieval texts do as well, is that late medieval texts is that that's not how it works, right? We are always all the things. You don't leave your emotions outside the door when you walk into a room. You don't leave your emotions outside the door when you walk into a house of worship. You don't leave your sexuality outside the door when you walk into a house of worship. You don't leave your spiritual self, whatever that may be, outside the door when you walk into a classroom. And that doesn't mean that we don't all have ways that are appropriate to behave in each of these settings, but there's a difference, I think, between how we behave and how we can imagine our whole selves. And so for me, in like everything I work on these days, emotion being central to it, and the embodied experience of emotion, which is a unwieldy term, but for lack of a better one, that's kind of what I've been saying. So we might call that affect also, right? It informs everything we do. And I think like looking away from that doesn't make it untrue. It just makes it, I don't know, it just makes it kind of harder to understand why we feel the way we feel about things.
Yeah. And maybe we need to look at what we're feeling, actually directly confront what we're feeling, come up with the words for it. This is something that comes up in my book about how to live like a monk. It's like naming emotions helps you process them.
And like allowing them to move through your body instead of suppressing them allows you to keep going, you know? And I think I do think we have a big fear of emotions these days in a way that maybe medieval people didn't. I don't know. That's a big claim. I don't know if I want to make that claim, but I do think we become really afraid of emotions. And this is partly like, I get at this a little in chapter 4. This is probably the inheritance of, like, among other things, Descartes and like kind of the idea of mind body dualism, but we can't not have them.
Yeah. And if you don't know what you're feeling, how are you going to figure out what is making you feel? And again, like things can't make you feel, but you feel things when you look at something. And how can you figure out how that's happening unless you know what you're feeling? So I'm bringing this up very deliberately because people have a lot of feelings right now. And one of the things that you are bringing up at the end of the book is politics and witnessing and the way that women are perceived in the political sphere. And so how some of those emotions might come up looking at women, the way they're speaking and how people are perceiving them today. So I wanted to invite you to talk about the way you're seeing this in politics today, if you like, and how you bring sort of a feminist and medievalist approach to looking at politics today. And I'm thinking of an American context because you're a scholar who works in the United States. Yeah. So I just invite you to talk about that as you like in the political sense.
So, I do talk about this in the book. Obviously, I wrote it, entirely before this year, and things have changed rapidly and a lot in this country in the last 8 months. But I do think we've had a really hard time in this country. And I allude to, or I mentioned briefly, examples from the UK and Australia as well in the book. The fact that we do see, and this is a very old way of seeing women's bodies as like incapable of telling the truth and incapable of being in charge and incapable of being rational and capable of doing anything that isn't entirely motivated by emotions and unwieldy sexuality. And that we have seen like this very long kind of discourse about this directed at one specific woman, Hillary Clinton, since the 90s. And it's been really stubborn, right? It's kind of been absorbed into so many different ways of talking about her that I don't think often people necessarily have realized that they might be repeating something that someone wrote in an op-ed in 1994, maybe before they were born, and not realize that's who they're quoting. I mean, this is something that for me in the period maybe 6 to 10 years ago, I was always kind of circling around. I think this has something to do with what I'm working on. And I couldn't kind of figure out why. And I finally got there in the book that I do think there's a particular way that, this is much older than the Middle Ages, this idea that women's bodies are ill-suited for political leadership or any kind of leadership. But I think there's a particular way in language in the late Middle English period where the word troth kind of transforms into like the modern truth and the older versions of troth. And this is drawing very much on the scholar Richard Firth Green, who wrote a whole book about this. The older version of troth had to do with things like integrity or fidelity to a person or an idea or an ideal. And that was something that a lot of, writers and thinkers perceived as gendered. And as that word transforms into the modern truth, I think that gendering kind of stuck to it in a way. So I think we're in the English language in particular, we're maybe extra willing to accept the idea that it can't be the truth if it's coming from a woman. And, we see this in like some of the accusations that have been leveled against female politicians in other English speaking countries as well, Australia, the UK. But that for me was something I kind of spent a long time trying to figure out how all these pieces were related. And I do think for me, writing this book kind of helped me get there in a way. And what I hope it helped me also get to is like to come out on the other side of that and think, well, okay, but this whole time there have been these misogynist discourses about, women not being able to tell the truth and women not being able to lead. There have been all these other discourses as well, right? Like that's part of what this book tries to trace is that there has always been a kind of understudied other medievalism alongside, and I guess I'm unintentionally evoking Foucault there and his other Victorians, but there has always been this other medievalism, right? There have always been these other medievalisms. I think it's really easy for us to think that medievalism is something that really stuffy old men in the 18th and 19th centuries, with like their elbow patches and their elaborate mustaches, were kind of sitting around in rooms and thinking about how they wanted to be like these like great men doing great deeds in the past. And like we can certainly see a lot of literature representing that. Mm-hmm. But there's always been all of this too. Like there have always been writers, not just women writers, but women writers and also writers of all genders kind of imagining other ways of thinking about the medieval past or other possible states of being that draw on medieval culture, medieval literature, or other futures that draw on them as well. And I think for me, kind of realizing that also affects what I can imagine politically has been really wonderful. And I think now here in the US, it certainly feels like we're in a moment where we're realizing that our imaginations have been maybe very small in terms of what we have thought was possible in the future. And, what our future looks like has maybe transformed enormously in the last couple months. And it's very exciting. And also it's a little bit like vertiginous. Things change really fast sometimes. And I think thinking about the kind of understudied other stories, other voices, other engagements that have been there all along, in some ways can help us to see that like this hasn't come out of nowhere. This is in some ways just something that's always been there, kind of breaking through into the mainstream.
Yeah, I think that this is all very powerful and something that while it has always been there as an undercurrent, it's starting to come to the forefront. And what I mean by that is that back in the day, like 100 years ago or so, you have the people with elbow patches that are writing, let's say they're fantasy novels. And you can't tell me that this is not an emotional engagement with the past, but they would say that it wasn't,
Of course.
And so I'm seeing the same thing where if you have people who are willing to put their feelings first in their scholarship or the way they come at life or the way they come at politics, it's starting to become something that is more acceptable and you can have more discussions about it. And I'm really thinking about, no, I'm not American, so I'm only like seeing from the outside, but some of the ways in which it's starting to be okay to have feelings as men, especially in the political sphere, which is something that, you weren't really allowed to have. You could have one emotion, which was not counting as an emotion, that was anger.
Right.
You could have that, but you couldn't have the other ones. And I'm starting to see a shift there in the way that people are allowing themselves to bring the way they feel to the way they think in a way that is overt. And that's a really interesting, exciting change I'm seeing, like not only in the political sphere, but also in medieval studies. I think it's a good change that's happening.
I think so too. And one of the things that I find the most exciting, I'm completely with you about this current moment, is that it feels like the range of acceptable emotions and expressions of emotion for men are just rapidly expanding. And that's so important and it's so powerful. I think it's really wonderful. And I think also in medieval studies, that opens up so much more for us to talk about and think about. And my students have been really interested in this. I mean, this ends up being so much of what we talk about in my classes is the kind of ways in which we might read male characters in fictional texts from the Middle Ages as grappling with either their emotions or the expectations that they shouldn't have emotions, or what is and isn't an acceptable emotion or affective state. It's been really eye-opening to see how my students who are like 20 years old are much more open to thinking about these things and much more open to thinking about like the vulnerability of men than maybe people my age, our age are. I find that really, really encouraging. And I also think with respect to politics that there's been this interesting way here in the US where I think as people have examined their feelings from 8 years ago or 10 years ago and grappled with them, in some ways that allows them to kind of move past them and think like, well, maybe I was defensive about this or I was resistant to this. And maybe this is why, because it made me feel this way. And I can examine that feeling. And then maybe I can realize that I don't want to be resistant to it. Right. A lot of it, I think, is about people being willing to and feeling safe doing a certain kind of internal work that people haven't, and not just men, that I think a lot of people haven't felt safe doing in the past. And that's been really powerful. For me, like watching men get excited about Kamala Harris has been really powerful. And my friends, and I also mean kind of people like en masse, right? There was a Zoom call of like 200,000 men called White Dudes for Harris, like raised a ton of money and broke Zoom, and all these famous people were on it. And It's really wonderful. And it feels really different. I mean, that to me, it does feel like we're on like the cusp of a real shift in what we imagine as possible in terms of like how people are allowed to behave based on how we perceive their gender. Right. And it's huge. It's enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. It's an exciting moment. I'm very excited to see the shift in the way people are allowing themselves to not just to feel their feelings, but to take a breath and say, I'm feeling this thing. And, not just react, although that's still happening quite a lot. We can't discount that. All right. So as we wrap up, bringing it back to the people who are listening to this because they're interested in looking at medieval texts, or maybe they want to go into medieval studies or something like that. What would you say to people about feelings and engaging with medieval texts? What would you say to them about how you view this working?
Wow. It's a big question.
I know.
I guess I would say in the time that you and I have been doing this, right, we've, I think, been through like a number of iterations of how we think we're supposed to feel about these texts. And I would say as much as possible, if you're reading these texts for the first time, be completely open. Like however you feel reading a text is valid, whether you like a text or dislike a text, or it makes you angry, or it makes you feel hopeful or joyful. Like those are all valid ways to feel. And yes, the next step or the step after that might be to kind of take a step back and think about why, and does the text want you to feel that way, and what kind of cultural forces might have affected how you're responding to the text. But we don't have to preempt our feelings. We don't have to do all those things before we have a reaction to a text. And I think often I have found something in a text moving and I have not known for years why that was interesting, or what about the text was doing that for me. And in some cases, I've ended up writing about texts years and years after I first felt moved by something in them and couldn't articulate what that was, or years after something about them irritated me and I couldn't articulate what that was. I think those feelings are really, really valid. And I think that has to be like the first step. Experience the text. I talk about this with my students too. I mean, I think we are also like in this moment for all kinds of reasons as readers that grow out of, I don't know, that maybe grow out of the way that literature has been taught, and the way that, especially as scholars, that we've maybe prioritized secondary readings and theoretical readings, and even like what students sometimes call like themes, right? Sort of like explore a theme in this text kind of reading. And I've started telling my students now, like all of those things are things that we see in the text, but we have to start with the text itself, right? And just approach the text. Like we will talk about what the plot is. We might not all agree on what the plot is. Like the plot is something that is an interpretation, right? A theme is an interpretation. You have to start with the text itself. And one of the best things I've ever heard anyone say about reading medieval literature, this is at a conference years ago in England, and her name was Molly Brown, I believe, was that we see things in these texts that people 50 years ago could not see. And 50 years from now, people will see things in these texts that we can't see. And if that wasn't true, like, why would we still be reading them? If everything there was to see had already been seen and written about and described, we would have nothing to gain and it wouldn't be interesting. And I think if we are in a really interesting moment now with respect to emotions and gender and maybe how we think about power, we're going to see things in these texts. Our students are going to see things in these texts that people have not seen before. And it's so exciting. So like for someone who's just reading them for the first time or just thinking about going into medieval studies for the first time, that's what I would say. Like, see what you see and feel what you feel. And it might be something that no one has seen before. And that doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it invalid. It might make it incredible. It might make it groundbreaking, and go from there, and then the next step is that you read what everyone else has said about the text and you see how what you think fits in with it. But I think being open to how a text affects us is something that we've been afraid to do for some time now. And, we might feel as scholars like we have to be objective and rational. And I think I really see an anxiety about that in my students. And I wish everyone could kind of feel freer to just approach a text from where they are, wherever that is. And I tell my students all the time too, that if you read a text today versus next week, you're going to experience it differently. I'm experiencing the world very differently today than I did 2 days ago. You might experience it differently if you're hungry. You might experience it differently if you slept badly last night or if it's warm out. I think that's great. I mean, all the ways in which I think I am experiencing late 14th and early 15th century texts now differently after our own pandemic. To me, it's really powerful to think about that. I don't know why we would want to put those things aside. I don't know why we'd want to put our own experiences and our own kind of emotions and embodied existences aside. I mean, not that we could anyway, but I don't know why we've convinced ourselves that that's a goal to have.
Or that we could. That we could.
Yeah. I mean, the most powerful thing about reading old books is like seeing all the ways in which those people were kind of like us, right? It's to find ways of feeling a sense of connection across time. And I don't know why we would want to put that aside.
Yeah, it's one of our strengths as human beings. Yeah. And I think that is everywhere in your book. And I hope that people will read it as a way of seeing how you can look at things, how you can think about them, how you can feel them, and how this can all work together in harmony, not in a way that's in conflict. Yeah. So thank you so much, Usha, for coming on. I'm just so pleased to meet you and have you on. This has just been a delight.
Thank you. This is really, really fun.
To find out more about Usha's work, you can find her on academia.edu. Her new book is Feminist Medievalisms, Embodiment and Vulnerability in Literature and Film. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey, well, I am back from a conference we were both at, actually, in Toronto about Christine de Pizan.
Yes. Yeah, so exciting. I'm always up for talking about and listening to people talk about Christine de Pizan.
Yeah, it was great. Susan Akbari kind of gave the keynote lecture, and it's been going on for 3 days. We only were there for the first day, but it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about Christine, actually, just from that.
Mm-hmm. And we got to go to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, which is part of the big library at University of Toronto, where all of the rare books are. I mean, you got to see University of Toronto's copy of Christine's Book of Peace, which this copy was not like written by her own hand or from her own life, but it's of course beautiful. It's one of the few copies of the Book of Peace, and we got to see it and touch it, and it was awesome.
Indeed. I thought it was really cool, actually. And also the Rare Book Library said that, hey, we actually digitized this. So I've actually kind of tweeted out some images from that copy, as well as the other stuff they have there in their collection, which is great. Like, wow.
Yeah, they're on it.
So that was a really kind of fun little adventure for a day.
Yeah, and I really want to remind people, we talk about this every once in a while, but it's a good reminder to have that the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, anybody can go and look at those manuscripts. So you just sign up online, say, I want to go and look at a manuscript. They will put it out for you. They'll show you how to look at it and gently touch it so you're not hurting anything. But any member of the public can go and actually see these manuscripts, touch them for themselves. And one of the things that the librarian said when we were there is that over the course of the school year this year, University of Toronto is going to have workshops at the Fisher for people who want to be introduced to things like medieval manuscripts. So just follow the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. You can find their website, and they'll be posting their programs, I think, very soon, so that if you are in Toronto, GTA, and you want to actually see these books for yourselves and learn about them, then you can absolutely do that.
And that's very true for other academic libraries around the world. They really do love to do public outreach, and, medieval manuscripts are like one of the things they love to show off. So see what's happening in your local area, and hey, you might find some medieval stuff just lying around.
Yeah, don't be shy. Librarians love to talk about this stuff, and usually you can get in and actually see and touch these manuscripts for yourself. Okay, back to the digital space. Peter, what's going on medievalist.net?
Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of Icelandic sagas. They're just magnificent stories. And I'm really happy that there's a new translation of one of them. It's called The Saga of John the Player.
Nice.
So it's a real fun one. So there's like a part where the king brings out the head of the queen's former lover to show off to John. And things are getting kind of real there, right? So it's a great little chivalric saga. So we tell you about that and like how you actually can read it for free. So it's open source.
Oh, so, I love free.
Yes. So we've got that. Plus, we have news on Viking economics, Steve Tibble on scavengers on the battlefield, and Laura Chevalier has a great piece on when losers write history.
Wait, not talking about us, right?
No.
What does this mean, when losers write history?
People who wrote about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, they're all on the loser side. All the people that wrote about the Viking invasions, they're all on the side that get beaten up. So but they have interesting things to say. And so Loris delves into that.
Awesome. Okay, we will all need to check that out and not take it personally, right?
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
This September, I'm back in the virtual classroom teaching my course, Calamity and Change, an Introduction to the 14th Century. Every week for 5 weeks, you get to spend an hour with me live on Zoom, learning about what life was like in the 14th century, how people dealt with the many disasters, and what we can learn from them. And I'll spend some extra time each week answering your burning questions about this, the best century of the Middle Ages. For more information or to register to join us, please visit medievalstudies.thinkific.com. Class begins September 6th. Thank you to everyone out there supporting my work through letting the ads play through, recommending my podcasts and books to your friends, signing up for class, or joining medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons are my personal heroes because it's patronage that allows me to keep this podcast going, so thank you. If you'd like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. And you can check out medievalist.net's sweet new medieval merch at tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet, where you can even get stuff with my super awesome logo on it. And if you do, take a picture and tag me on social media so I can say thanks. For everything from Madonna to Madonnas, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.